All right, welcome guys. We are live on Google Hangouts for an episode of The Other Side. We have, by we I mean my cohort Mike Margison and I have been attempting to make this thing work now for goodness, Mike, what, maybe a month or so at least?
Yeah, we've been trying for a good month, and I honestly I don't even remember what was the original topic, because it's changed now several times.
Yeah, no,
Because it wasn't Hamilton.
Yeah. Over the summer, we were going to attempt to record a joint episode using the software, and while while we have some expertise and knowledge in the social sciences, technology is something that we're still working through, and so we've got a podcast software that we use, but the different avenues that we had explored using that weren't quite coming out the way that we had liked, and so we tried to record one, apart from one another through Hangouts, through our software, and then got together. And anyway, long story short, we're finally attempting here today to jump on with Hangouts on air and stream live on YouTube, and we'll see how all of this plays out. But obviously, with the recent events of what's been going on in our country here over the last week, Mike and I decided it might be beneficial to host a show over what had gone on in Charlottesville. And if anyone had a chance or an opportunity to listen to what I had to say last night, I just spoke briefly about this in regards more to the historical side of the right of the Confederacy to secede from the Union, and then just kind of took a little bit of an opportunity to address some of what I have seen and read in regard to revisionist history, or as I called it on Facebook earlier this week, 8th grade populist history, where unfortunately, Mike, and I'm sure that you see this too, as we engage with our current students and then even with former students, we want to encourage people to be able to go out and read for themselves and decide, what they feel. And as I always tell my class, I am not here to tell you what to think, but to encourage you to think. Obviously, I have a viewpoint that I want to try to let everybody know how I feel, but I'm certainly not in the business of trying to ramrod my viewpoints down people's throats. So anyway, having said that, I think what we wanted to try to do today is just talk about the fact that with what has gone on in Charlottesville, that there's some difficult dialogue that needs to be had here, and that maybe part of the reason why we're seeing the rise of fringes on both sides is due to the lack of understanding and dialogue that we have with one another in our society today. And whatever the causes of that are, whether they're just too difficult of topics to discuss, or how we handle our discussions through social media today, the fact remains is that we have to come together as a society and discuss these issues. And so that's kind of where we wanted to go with this today. So Mike, I'll throw it over to you to kind of talk about your perspective on this, and maybe provide the listeners with a little bit of understanding as to some of what we're talking about here.
All right, great. Yeah, I think that dialogue is the biggest problem that we see in this country, especially with respect to, certainly specifically Charlottesville, but any difficult issue that we have, there seems to be almost, like one allowable message or talking point that you have to follow. And if you deviate from that at all, you start to get labeled or name called. And I think that's really dangerous. And with Charlottesville, for instance, it's so racially charged, race-based discussions are really, really difficult to have. They're uncomfortable, I think, for everybody. And when you're faced with these difficult issues, there is nothing at that point more important than open and honest dialogue. That's the only way that you can get to solutions or mutual understanding, and that really understanding, both sides understanding each other, I think is one of the things that would eliminate the violence. But we don't have that, because I don't think that these issues are discussed openly, and I don't think that they're discussed honestly. And when I I was trying to catch up really on Charlottesville, because on Saturday I didn't have the news on. I didn't have my phone on. I was out with people. The only TV that we had on during the day, we had people over, and they all have kids the same age, you know, around 3, 4. And so Disney Junior was the only thing on. They weren't showing the Charlottesville riots, of course. So I spent the week really trying to catch up on what happened in Charlottesville. And it was frustrating for me because I got so many different versions of, you know, the same event, which makes it challenging. So what I began to notice is that there was one acceptable narrative in this story, and it was kind of reduced to, you have Nazis and you have people who were against Nazis. Which side are you going to take? And it's like done over. And that's an obvious, you know, that's an obvious one. And so as I was catching up on the news, I mean, I was pretty much one-sided when I began reading about what happened in Charlottesville. It was like an open and shut case, right? And you had this neo-Confederate white supremacist rally. You had these counter protesters who showed up to say, your views are not okay, which is true, right? Their views are not okay. And then or in response to that, some, you know, neo-Nazi, neo-Confederate drove his car into these counter protesters and killed somebody. And that was, you know, that was the kind of tragic conclusion to the entire thing. And that being, you know, the more or less simplified version of events, it does make it an open and shut case. But as I began to kind of dig through more facts, and really what I did is I went to more independent media sources, and they are out there. And I think, you know, a lot of people have expressed to me, I don't want bias one way or the other. You know, I don't want an opinion when I get my news. I simply just want the facts, and I want to, you know, I want to make up my own mind. I think there's a lot of people who want that, but that is increasingly difficult to get today. But there are independent voices out there. There are independent media out there, and the version of events that seemed to me to have the least amount of bias were events from the events that were chronicled by Keith Preston, right? Is it Attack the System?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Attack the System. He had a book called Attack the System, and he had a website called Attack the System. And one of the, I guess, valuable things about Keith Preston is that he dislikes, you know, the established right and the established left equally. He's going to dislike Fox News and MSNBC equally. So I mean, there is no implicit bias in his reporting. There is just the facts as he sees them. Now, he's a human being who's subject to his own bias. We get that. But this really seemed to be about the most straightforward message that I saw. And after reading Keith's analysis of what happened, it took on a completely different meaning for me. And this is why I came in, and you remember, I think it was Thursday morning, and I said, Justin, do I have this right? You know, am I getting these facts right? And you were kind of a little bit foggy too. But the fact of the matter is it was almost impossible. This should be something where we can just get the normal facts of what happened, and there shouldn't be multiple different stories of the accounts. So anyway, I'm gonna try and get through this quickly. But after reading Keith's analysis, what it looked like is you had this Unite the Right rally, and you can argue about whether or not Unite the Right is a hate group. He didn't really portray it as a hate rally. I think he portrayed it more as this rally of different factions of people who are outside the Republican establishment, you know, not, you know, outside the right. So, you know, term alt-right, but outside the Republican establishment. He identifies different groups, patriot groups, 3 percenters who are in there, and, you know, maybe some kind of far right libertarian groups and so on and so forth. But what struck me then is that this was the first time, and I think this was Thursday, this was the first time that I learned that this was not a white supremacist rally, right? This was an alt-right rally. And I think there might be people listening who say, okay, alt-right, white supremacy, the exact same thing. But there are different agendas there. And so this was a rally that was held, and I think that it was a rally from what I'm able to gather, this was a rally that was held that was really hijacked by white supremacist groups, because they decided, who are we going to allow under, in this Unite the Right, who are we going to allow? And eventually the decision was made that they wouldn't close it off to any group. So anybody who wanted to show up, neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, whatever you want to call these morons, white supremacists, they were not barred from coming. And some people have said that, because of that decision, more moderate groups decided not to show up. And I have to believe, I have to believe that if more moderate groups didn't show up because they learned of that, there were people who first learned of their presence when they showed up, right? Normal people who might have been showing up because they don't consider themselves part of the Republican establishment. They don't agree with the removal of statues as a way to solve anything. They might have shown up to this rally, seeing that there were guys with these, swastikas on their arm, waving a Confederate flag, and they turn around and they get right back in their car and they go home. And in fact, that's exactly what I would have done if I would have showed up, because I am against the removal of statues. As I don't see that as a solution to anything. Especially historical statues. So that might be something where I would show up and say, hey, look, I don't agree that this is going to solve any problems. But if you see somebody with swastikas and Confederate flags, the first thing I would do is turn around, get back in my car and say, I'm not associated with these people, and go home. What you're going to have there is you're going to have a situation where these idiots are overrepresenting the rally. So while I don't think that this was a white supremacist rally, what I believe happened is that this was an alt-right rally that got hijacked by the neo-Nazis.
Yeah, no, those are some great points, and I just wanted to real quickly jump in on a couple of things before we got too far away that you had brought up there that I think are absolutely vital and important. And going back to what you mentioned toward the beginning, there is what we oftentimes, or the phrase that gets used today, of virtue signaling. The issue that, one has a superior moral stance on the subject, therefore you have to be wrong. And the question that I think arises out of that is who gets to define that position, right? And oftentimes I think, and it can happen on both sides of the debate, but I just hear so many people that implicitly, see, that's the thing, they imply a lot of what they say. They won't ever really flat out come out and say it, because they know that if they do that, then they're going to lose, not only the person that they're trying to discuss this with, right, but other people as well. So yeah, I think that you absolutely have to kind of break down that barrier. And then the other thing that you talked about that I think is absolutely vital and is key to what you're mentioning here is defining terms, right? I always tell my students in the classroom, the definitions matter, terms matter. And so, if you were to throw the phrase out there, alt-right, you could say that to 10 different people and probably get 10 different definitions of what you would first off identify as the alt-right, and then who would be included in that. Right. I listened to a great podcast the other day that kind of discussed that and went over and talked about, some people probably put Fox News in as the alt-right. Breitbart is alt-right. All of these other, the Make America Great Again type people they would say, oh, that's all right, because what they really mean is they want it to return back to whatever their vision of America was, back in the 1950s and 60s. Right. So, defining those terms are vital to understanding. But see, we don't want to have that discussion. You have in your mind who you think it is. Right. And so then by nature, then you're going to include people that if you ask me what I think, I might not see that person or that group as alt-right. And I think that's an important distinguishment to make there in having these discussions that we're talking about, because then it kind of clears the air and sets a record straight of, well, what are we talking about here? These people that were probably more moderate in their beliefs and their political ideology that were against the statue removal had probably not a whole lot in common with the people, as you said, that when you showed up and saw, oh yeah, they've got swastikas patches on the side of their arm. I don't think I want to go quite that far with this. But in the eyes of somebody on the left, you're just as guilty, right? because you're being associated with those people.
Exactly. And Justin, you understand that, I mean, look, there are people who are going to listen to this, and because we're veering off the allowable narrative, we are now like Nazi sympathizers. Just like by virtue of having this conversation, there are people who are going to say we're not, this is just, we're apologists for these neo-Confederate groups.
Oh, absolutely. And that's kind of what I mentioned and talked a little bit about last night in my YouTube live video, was this notion and understanding that, look, I am unapologetic about my stance that I believe that the Confederate States had a political right to secede from the Union. And
Yes.
that, kind of started to dive into some of that. That does not mean that I am an advocate for slavery. All right. That's a completely different subject. But unfortunately, as you were alluding to earlier, I read also even some scholarly articles. I mentioned last night that I read an article from a professor at George Washington University that was on Yahoo the other day, in which he was kind of hitting back a little bit at the Trump comments on, well, okay, if we're going to take down the Robert E. Lee statues, when are we going to take down the Hamilton statues? When are we going to take down the Washington statues? And unfortunately, the narrative on that side had devolved into, well, yeah, these guys were slaveholders, but they treated their slaves a little bit better than they did down in the South. And first off, that's absolute hogwash. There's no evidence for that. I don't know that you can make that pure of a statement that in the North they treated slaves better than the South. I'm sure there were Northern slaveholders that were more sympathetic to their slaves and probably treated them better, but there were probably just as many or more that were very, very brutal to their slaves.
If you pick and chose which accounts you wanted to, you could make that happen. I mean, you could start with a conclusion, go find evidence to make the conclusion happen.
Right, absolutely. And so I saw some of that. And then I think I briefly mentioned too, this International Business Journal article that I read from this young lady who was making the claim that, that the Confederacy was the moral equivalent to Nazi Germany. Yeah. And so again, I, challenge our listeners here to think those things through a little bit more and don't accept those statements at face value. But unfortunately, Mike, as we've talked about, the dominance of the social media narratives and the mainstream media, that's where a lot of people are getting their knowledge from today without going back and reading primary documents or going back and considering whose version of events am I reading here, right? Because that's bias as well on both sides, but you have to take that into account. And
it
so
is on both sides, but there is way too much confirmation bias in discussion, and like I just said, it's you get your conclusion first, and then you find how to get it confirmed, and that's one of the things that makes dialogue almost impossible, because if I go get my conclusion first and you go get your conclusion first, and then we go face to face and try and have a discussion, it's not going to happen. Essentially what's happening, I'm not listening to you. I'm just waiting for my turn to talk. And then I'm going to spew my talking points, and then you're going to go to the same. And nothing gets solved this way. And it's really, really problematic. And again, like I said, especially with difficult issues that are difficult and uncomfortable to talk to. These are the times when you actually have to have appropriate, meaningful, valuable, purposeful dialogue. And it's simply not happening.
Yeah, no, that is a fantastic point. And I have had conversations with people recently, and I think a couple of things that you hit on there is number one, no matter where you shake down on this, if you're going to try to engage people to kind of get them to see things in a certain light, you kind of, like you said, you have to go in it with a goal. What is your goal in engaging somebody, in discussions on this? Are you just trying to score bonus points, talking points, aha, I got you moments, I always see that all the time from all different sources on media. They've got representatives from both sides and, oh, watch this epic takedown of this person. Is that right? Really what we're trying to do? What are we accomplishing by simply doing that? I mean, yes, if you want to discredit somebody in a debate style or a dialogue style format, and that happens, okay. But what is the end of that, right? Is it that you've convinced somebody to see the errors of their way? Okay, I'm good with that. But if it's exactly to score style points, what are we getting out of that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. And I don't think there are a whole lot of people who are open to being open. And look, I've been accused of that. It's not true, but I've been accused of just being, the closed-minded, Republican, and anything Republicans do, I'm just going to agree with. And that's absolutely not true. There's no evidence to suggest it. I refused to, vote for John McCain in 2008. I actually felt bad because I felt responsible for Obama getting elected. So I held my nose and I voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. But my point is it's just, I'm not just this in the tank Republican who's going to toe a party line and say whatever. But I think, a lot of the times that's what you have. People aren't really, really open to being open and open to hearing other sides. And that's kind of where I was going with that, with the Charlottesville statement. And before we wrap up here, I do need to mention the Antifa, which was my point, and where I was going with that whole introduction is Antifa and their role in the riots, because you wouldn't have read anywhere in the days after Saturday the role that Antifa played. And in fact, I didn't even realize the role that they played. I knew that there were counter protesters, but until I read that Preston article. And so what you have is you have this group that is going to protest the statue removal, but they're thugs, right? These white supremacists, they're thugs. And I think that they were there to intimidate and, they're losers. But on the other side, you had this Antifa group who shows up, and they show up. They're the ones who showed up at Trump rallies throughout the election cycle. They're the ones who went to that particularly bloody one in Sacramento, where they just went and they started beating up Trump supporters. And they show up at these things. They bring bottles and sticks and rocks, and they cover their face. And they're not there to have a dialogue. They're there to beat up Republicans. I mean, that is their goal, to violently harm them. And that's what they showed up at this rally for. And I don't think Preston, and I'd have to go back and read it, I don't think he ever directly said Antifa started it, but he seemed to hint at that the violence, that's when the violence began, is when they showed up ready to fight. Now, these neo-Nazis, anybody who shows up ready to fight, it's an open invitation. And I think the way Preston kind of put it is they might not have gone looking for a fight, but they certainly weren't going to turn one down. And they knew the counter protesters were coming. So you have both sides who show up armed. They're ideologically about as far apart as you can get. They're all thugs. And you mix this into a stew, and what you're going to have is the tragic events of what happened. But what's important, I think what Preston was getting at, was that Antifa is at least 50% responsible for the violence. And my entire point of it is that's the side that you never hear, right? Because the whatever you want to call them, they're for leftist causes. So if you want to call them alt-left, fine. But they are a violent thug group who goes with no other intention to beat up Republicans. There was a free speech rally in Boston yesterday. I don't know if you saw it, but you have video of one of these guys going up to an elderly woman and taking her down. She was holding a flag. They ripped the flag away from her. She loses her balance. She goes down into the ground. I mean, this is the MO of these people. And when Trump said, look, there was violence on both sides, what was the national reaction to that? I mean, he was absolutely excoriated for saying that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But that's the truth. That's what happened. And we're not allowed to talk about the truth. It's simply, it's no good.
Right. And to take it a step further, the shame of it, and I saw this, I could pull it up and repost it on my social media accounts. I saw people heralding the alt-left, the Antifa as heroes.
Right.
These people were being put on par, Mike, with U.S. soldiers in World War II. I mean, there were flat out comparisons being made to these people as, wait a second, these guys are exterminating Nazis. What's the problem here?
Exactly.
Well, the problem is that we don't live in a thugocracy. We don't live in a vigilante society that people who are the thought police can just go out and eliminate people. just because they don't simply agree with them. Now, if somebody crosses the line and commits an act of violence, we have officials that can take care of that stuff. So yeah, not only was there a backlash against saying, hey, wait a second, these guys were partially to blame for this, and again that knee-jerk reaction of then that gets equated to
he's a Nazi sympathizer. That's what I mean. That's been their narrative really all along.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up. The last thing that I wanted to end with here, and then I'll throw it back to you to wrap up anything else that you want to say, is a popular podcast, libertarian podcast that we both listen to pretty regularly, the Tom Woods Show. Tom Woods is a great advocate for libertarian thought. I highly encourage all of you to go out and give his podcast a listen to. It is widely known and available in a lot of different areas. But at any rate, he got into a little spat with some other libertarians this week who wouldn't sign a petition essentially denouncing this. And his point was, look, these guys' ideology is as far from anything that I would ever agree with or be a part of. I'm not signing a petition on that. And so then, of course, that devolves into, well, then you're a neo-Nazi. This trash that just gets thrown around and stuff like this. So I mentioned that here at the end just to say that, as you develop individually your thoughts out there on what you feel about these things, don't be discouraged, don't be bullied, don't be pushed around into saying that if you have thoughts and opinions on things that if it doesn't jive with what your friends on Facebook are saying or what pressures you're getting in the office or whatever, because look, there are a lot of people who aren't skinhead Nazis that have certain viewpoints, and they are absolutely they're being destroyed. Their lives are being destroyed. They're losing their jobs. They're losing family. They're losing loved ones because of their beliefs and whatnot. And I just want to encourage people that may, have a sense or feeling that, look, I don't agree with this part of it, but I have some thoughts here that I think I might align with on that. Stay strong in your convictions there. Don't be intimidated. Don't be bullied into having to believe a certain narrative just because, you're afraid or you're being intimidated by other people.
Awesome ending. I mean, I would just reiterate the same thing and have dialogue. Look, we need more dialogue. That's plain and simple. You find somebody who you disagree with 100% and just let them talk. Whether you're on the right or the left, let them talk and get to know them. Ask them questions. Why do you believe this? Where do you come? And then you can get into debate. Yeah, but what about this? Have you thought of this? And if you're open to listening and you're open to this type of dialogue, you're going to see that the vast majority of people have more in common than they have apart. I really actually believe that. It's just that we don't listen to one another enough to ever actually find that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. I'm glad we were able to get this put together here. We'll package it up and get it out as well for review for those that couldn't catch it live. Again, this is something that if the format works out well, I think we want to both have been in agreement that we want to try to go to doing this on a more permanent basis with the podcast. And so I think we'll take a look at our Hamilton podcast that we've had in the can here for a while now, and maybe get that recorded and get that out next. So I want to thank you all for listening today. And as always, if you have any questions, contact us through our social media platforms, our email, margisonandspears@gmail.com. And as we always say, your education isn't complete until you've heard the other side.